Hello and welcome to Tim's BMW repairs and information. Nikasil, what a disaster for BMW. It was absolutely awful. It cost them absolute millions of pounds. But worse than that, it made them lose face against the other big German car manufacturers such as Audi and Mercedes-Benz. They were at the bottom of the bucket in the 90s. They really were. And to make it worse, it was the 7 Series, the E32, the flagship range of BMW that was going wrong. And they weren't just going wrong in a little way. No, 30,000 mile engines were dead. They were scrap metal. They're only suitable to be re-smelted in the foundry. And what was happening was the Nikasil plating in the engine was disappearing. It was just vanishing into thin air. There wasn't anything left of it. And that meant no compression in the engine because all that was left was an aluminium alloy bore and it wore out. And that meant the cars didn't start. And for a 7 Series, the flagship of the BMW range, this was a disaster. And not only that, the period before they actually stopped being able to start the engines, they bunged out plumes of blue oil smoke and it really wasn't a great look. So just imagine the scene. In 1994, we're in Dingolfing, the headquarters of BMW car production. The CEO is absolutely livid. He's getting his ear bent from all over. The shareholders are kicking him. The servicing and garaging and the dealerships are giving him a good kicking, and he's going to pass on that good kicking. So who's he got in his meeting? Well, he's obviously got the directors of the foundry who are actually casting the engine blocks. He's got the head of engines, head of quality and inspection. Maybe it's a quality problem. Maybe they're just not plating the bores properly. Also in there, he's got a representative from Shell, fuels, because it appears that the fuel might be damaging the Nikasil plating. And he's got a representative from Mahler, who are the patent holders of the Nikasil process. A process which they devised in the 1960s and has been working perfectly on a whole lot of other engines. It's only BMW that seem to be having the problem. So out of all of those people in that meeting, who's going to get the blame? Who's going to have their head knocked off, kicked out of their office and kicked all the way down the road? Well, I can't give you the answer, but I'll tell you this. The people who were responsible for the Nikasil fiasco were not in that room. And they've never got the blame. But from a 2020 viewpoint, I can tell you who was to blame, and it's pretty obvious when you think about it. And they never got the blame, but I'm going to reveal to you today who actually caused the Nikasil fiasco. And it's the same people that caused the same fiasco with Jaguar and their XJ8, which suffered exactly the same problem with the Nikasil bore. Now, if they had found the right people, XJ8 wouldn't have been a disaster, nor would the M52 engine, which suffered from Nikasil failure as well, and the M60 engine. They could have kept that going. And instead, they had to rush into production the M62, the new V8, which had no Nikasil plating. It had a completely different alloy to build the engine, much the same as the M70 V12 engine. But anyway, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So let's go back before this to 1988, when the 7 Series, the E32, was introduced. And it's introduced with a beautiful V12 5-litre engine. It was fantastic. It was all the latest stuff as well. It had light alloy crankcase, heads, completely aluminium alloy engine, and it had so much electronics on it, running one lot of electronic control units for each bank, and then another control unit, the EML, which controlled the throttles and the cruise control and the dynamic stability control. It was so ahead of its time. And even with all that electronics, it was very reliable. It's different when we look back in 2020 and say, well, they're not reliable because the throttle bodies fail and HT lead, the cylinder identification sensor fails. Well, these cars are ancient now. But when they're first out into the world, they were fantastic. And the idea was the E32 would be brought out with the V8 and the V12. But unfortunately, the M60 V8 wasn't ready, and so reused the M30 engine from earlier cars. And that again was a fantastic engine, but it was showing its age a bit. It was a cast iron crankcase, so it was a heavy old engine, single cam, tappets on it, had distributor and leads, and it wasn't going to be anywhere near as advanced as the new V8. Now, of course, the M70 V12, fantastic engine, very reliable, robust, lasts forever. That was still a bit old technology. I mean, we still had 2 distributors, HT leads, cylinder identification sensors, and all sorts of stuff like that. And of course, 2 valves per cylinder, the same as the M30, that was 2 valves per cylinder as well. So the new V8 they were producing was well ahead of the game. It was a fantastic engine. And if the Nikasil plating process hadn't caused so many problems, it would have gone on for years and years. But it was a fantastic engine. It was radical in so many ways. So instead of distributors, it had coil over plug units, so it had direct ignition. It had 4 valves per cylinder and had quad overhead cams. And more than that, it didn't have any rockers. So there was so little play between the cam and the valves themselves. So instead of rockers and tappets and all the rest, they had a simple system having a cam, and underneath it would be a lash adjuster, or I can't remember what the other word they called it, but it was a hydraulic lash adjuster. And the lash adjuster just pushed down on the valves, returned by the spring. And anywhere was taken up by this hydraulic lifter. That was the other word I was thinking of. So yes, I mean, extraordinarily advanced for, well, the 80s, which was when it was being designed. And it wasn't a performance engine. It was a cross-plane crankshaft, so it wasn't designed like a performance engine with a flat plane. So it's going to have the sort of lazy, lollopy sound of the American V8s. But it's going to be very smooth because, of course, cross-plane crankshafts are very smooth, but they're very heavy, so it wasn't going to be a high revving engine. And to go along with this thought about being economical, it also had, instead of iron liners, it had a process to plate the bores. And that process was called Nikasil, devised by Mahler in 1967, being used in a lot of other engines. You don't hear about this, but it's used in a lot of engines. And the process is, well, Nikasil stands for nickel silicon carbide, which is a silicon carbide, extraordinarily tough material. And it was an electroless plating system, and they had a bath of nickel salts, and dispersed into it had silicon carbide. And they had a lot of other bits and bobs in there, but Mahler kept that close to their chest. They wouldn't let anyone know what the other chemicals in it was. But it was plated using an anode and the block as the cathode. And how it worked is the nickel was plated onto the cylinder walls, and it also pulled with it the silicon carbide. And so now, a very thin coating, by the way, it's only about 0.03 of an inch, but we've got nickel and contained in it silicon carbide. And then there's 2 processes used to make the cylinder bore suitable for a piston, which was electro-etching, which removed some of the nickel, so it exposed the silicon carbide. And then there was a honing process that flattened the tops of the silicon carbide. Now, the whole trick with Nikasil and other plating methods is that it is oleophilic, which means that it soaks up oil. And that's the most important thing about this plating design, was that it slurped up oil into it, and then the piston with its chrome rings, because it had chrome rings, was the hard surface it was sitting against, slid up and down in the oil, and only the very tips of the silicon carbide were proud. And so there was so little wear. Basically the pistons were whizzing up and down on a layer of oil rather than any material itself. And that made the car so much more efficient and economic because there was so little friction. It also allowed a few other things, which is why an iron liner-less system was used in the V12, because without the liners you can squeeze the engine up and put the cylinder bores much closer together. And the same reason was on the V8. It was spaced a lot closer together because there's no need for an iron liner. And the Nikasil plating with the oil absorbed into it and the silicon carbide sticking out of it was extraordinarily hard, and it was expected that the engine was going to last 300,000 miles, 400,000 miles. I mean, the Nikasil process, as I said, was used lots of other places, and it's so superior to an iron liner for many reasons, one of them being it transferred heat a lot better. So you didn't end up with hot spots in the engine. You could run the engine hotter and higher compression without worrying about pre-ignition detonation. So there were a lot of good reasons for using the Nikasil plating process. And that V8 was just fantastic because it was so economic. And from a 3-litre V8, which produces 218 brake horsepower, it's the same power as the 3.5 straight 6. And it used a lot less petrol doing so. It was super efficient. And it was quiet as well, without the rockers and tappets and all the adjustments that go with it. Very quiet, very sophisticated and smooth engine. But unfortunately, it started going wrong. And what was happening was the Nikasil plating was failing. It was actually dissolving and leaving behind the plain aluminium bore. And of course, Mahler got the blame for this, being the patent holder of Nikasil. And of course, the foundry, they got the blame for it. But neither of those were responsible for the failure of the Nikasil plating. The modern wisdom says it was the high sulfur levels in the petrol that was being used, in the gas that was being used, and the sulfur was getting into the nickel, producing sulfuric acid and just eating the nickel away. And once the nickel gets eaten away, then the silicon carbide just falls off the bore. And that's what appeared to be happening. But they missed out a couple of obvious points. The fact that the high sulfur petrol wasn't touching the nickel. We had a surface layer of oil, that it was impregnated with oil. And this was the reason that so many other engines were running Nikasil properly. They weren't having failures at all. They weren't going wrong. And we're not just talking about high performance engines, because I've heard it say so many times, well, the Porsche 911 had Nikasil plating and they never went wrong. And the reason for that was it was hotter. It ran hotter, and so we didn't have any problems with the plating. Well, that isn't true. It isn't true at all, because Nikasil was used in so many other engines. For instance, they were used in Mercury outboard engines, which were cooled by seawater. Now, you don't get much colder than that, I'm afraid. No, there was hundreds, thousands, in fact millions of engines running perfectly with high sulfur fuel without any problems at all. And they're working for millions of hours. They were just going on forever. And funnily enough, of course, the M60 in 2020 is still going strong. In fact, it's thought of as the most reliable engine in the BMW V8 range. Because with the M62, you've got the timing chain guides made out of plastic, disintegrate, and then all sorts of horrible things go wrong. And with the M62 tub, you've got Vanos and its solenoids, and it just goes wrong. And of course, the temperature map thermostat, which of course just frizzles everything. So from 2020, you look back and you say, well, the M60 is the most reliable engine. Well, 1994 it wasn't. It was absolutely dead in the water. And they had to rush through the M62 to take its place. So what is the difference between all these millions of engines which were running properly and BMW's M60 which failed? And also, of course, we had the M52/6 engine with the Nikasil plating. That failed. And very famously, the XJ8, Jaguar's flagship car, it had the Nikasil plating problem, and that completely failed as well. But there was something else at play here, and the reason that some cars managed to get through and keep running properly. And it was a manifold problem. It had quite a few things to it, but the most important thing, and the reason that these M60 engines went wrong, was software. As simple as that, and it could have been sorted out with 4 lines of code in the software that ran the fuel injection system. Right, okay, so try and explain that. Well, first of all, the M60 engined E32 and the other places where the M60 was used and XJ8 suffer from something else, which was flooding. They're well known for it. The M60 just flooded for no reason at all. And what was happening is you'd try and start it, it almost went, but it didn't. And then when you tried to start it the next time, it just whizzed round and did nothing at all. Sounded like a sewing machine. Either that or the battery went flat, and you put a brand new battery on it and it still wouldn't start. The engine was flooded. And to get it going again, the only thing you could do was remove 4 of the spark plugs, put some oil down the bores, tiny bit amount of oil down the bores, plugs in, coil over, plug units back in, and then it would try to start. It tried to start on the 4 cylinders with oil in it, and it would take forever. And the plan was always to put your foot flat on the throttle, have a brand new battery, have another car with jump leads with the other car running to keep the voltage up, turn the key to the stop and just keep it there until either the engine started or the starter motor started smoking. And it didn't just start in a normal sort of way, it sort of start up a cylinder at a time, and one cylinder would start and the revs would slightly increase, 2, 3, and by the time it got to 4, which could be almost a minute later, it might just keep going under its own steam, so you could let go of the key and keep your foot flat on the floor. And you had to keep it up to 3,000, 4,000 RPM, because if you let your foot feather the throttle, it would just stop again and you'd be right back to the start. No, you had to keep it going at 3,000 or 4,000 RPM, and clouds of smoke would be coming out of the back of it, and you thought, I mean, this car's had it. It's just something horrible's gone wrong with the bores. But it was just flooding, and eventually, after a little while, all 7 cylinders would get going, and you get the car running, and about 10 minutes later, number 8 would chime in, and off you go. Okay, so what was happening was that the software in the DME 3.3, which was used on the M60 engine, had a little trick where just as you turned the key to start the engine, it would squirt petrol into the engine from all 8 injectors. For what reason, I've no idea, possibly to try and start it quicker, but it didn't. And what it did was just put too much fuel into the engine. And if the engine failed to start and you turned the key back and you turned it forward again, it squirt more fuel into the engine. And by this point, the manifold is flooded with petrol. There's petrol everywhere, and the engine isn't going to start. It's not just flooded, i.e. the mixture's too rich, it's lost all compression. And the reason it's lost compression is that fuel's wiped the oil from the bores. And now we've got exposed silicon carbide and nickel with high sulfur fuel sitting on those bores. And we know that the high sulfur fuel produces sulfuric acid, eats away the nickel. And that's what was killing the BMW M60. And it's exactly the same problem for the XJ8. And if you look on any of the forums, one of the big points with the XJ8 is they flood. They have such problem getting the things going in certain conditions. And exactly the same problem was happening, was that the cylinder walls would be washed of their protective oil, exposing the nickel to the high sulfur fuels, produce sulfuric acid, and it would eat away the Nikasil plating, and that's the end of that. So the people who should have been blamed for the M60 fiasco and XJ8 and the M52 and a few other engines was the software department, the people who were writing the code. And I tell you, being a software writer myself, it would have been so simple to remove that 4 lines of code, and then BMW wouldn't have had problems with the Nikasil plating come off. And it's as simple as that. I'm absolutely convinced of this as well, having looked into this problem for quite a few years. Where you have flooding, you have the loss of oil on the cylinder walls, and you have petrol in direct contact with nickel, and the sulfur level in petrol will kill it will turn to sulfuric acid and it will eat the nickel away. It's as simple as that. And if you remove the code that squirted the fuel into the engine just before it started, BMW would never have had this problem, because a Nikasil plated bore, being oleophilic and holding all that oil, just doesn't get affected by petrol. It is not affected by the sulfur content in petrol when the engine's running properly. It's the oil stops the petrol getting to it, because don't forget, it's only petrol vapor until it's compressed and then it's expanding gases. It just doesn't have the time to break down the oil and get through to the nickel. No, the only time that happens is when the engine's flooded. And it happened so often with the M60, it became an embarrassment just as much as the Nikasil did. And I had an M60. My first 7 Series was an E32 with the M60 3-litre engine, and that just used to flood all the time. And it was okay once you got used to it. You knew when it was going to flood. And it was always the case that if you moved the car just 50 yards and stopped it, the next time you're going to start it was going to either do a long crank or it wasn't going to start. And it just, exasperating. But that was the reason. Of course, by the time I had the car in the 2000s, 2003, of course the sulfur levels in fuel had reduced, and now we have ultra low sulfur content petrol. So it doesn't really matter if it floods, well, apart from the blooming nuisance it causes getting the thing going again, but it isn't going to damage the bores. I mean, the piston rings are now sitting on top of silicon carbide, and it doesn't wear anything out. It's more likely to wear out the piston rings, which are made out of chromium plated, than anything else. Once you put the oil down the bores, which brings back up the compression, because we're just replacing the oil that the petrol's washed off the bores, the compression comes back up again, and it will start eventually when it's burnt off all the petrol that's sitting in the manifold. And the same, as I said, it's exactly the same with XJ8s. And if you look on the forums, there's the same sort of advice that I give out on MeekNet about how you restart an XJ8 with the V8 by putting oil down the spark plug bores and so on. So, and the M52 as well, that had the same problem, forever flooding. And it's just DME 3.3. I'm not sure if I think it's 5.2 on the M52, but I can't remember at the moment. But yeah, XJ8 had the same problem, but they started removing this squirting in of all-weight injectors at some point, which probably saved them. And BMW never got around to it, I'm afraid. So yes, who's the culprit? Who should have got the blame? Who should have been kicked out of BMW and kicked all the way down the road? It was the software department, the coding department. They should have blamed him.
Well, it really does beg the question, why did BMW persevere with Nikasil for so long? I mean, they used it in the M52 years after the M60 was causing so many problems. And why, after 6 or 7 years, did Jaguar use it in their brand new V8? Well, the answer to that is they both knew there was nothing wrong with the plating process. In fact, BMW were using Nikasil in their motorbikes very successfully, didn't have any problems at all, and it was doing exactly what they wanted. Had so little wear, it allowed the cylinders to get closer together, didn't have any hot spots because of the better heat conduction, so they could raise the compression and get more power out of the same cubic capacity. No, the Nikasil process was an excellent idea, and it's still being used today. And there are companies out there which will replate your bores, if you like, using Nikasil, and then they'll hone it and do all the rest of the stuff to make it a fully oleophilic bore, and it will last forever. So no, I'm afraid it just ended up the wrong people being blamed and never quite understanding what the problem was. And of course, one of the reasons for that is BMW maintained their own cars so well, they never got into a situation where they had flood. Because the problem with the old E32 was, if I didn't use it for a couple of weeks and the battery voltage was depleted, it didn't start. And one of the reasons was that each of the coilover plug units had current bled from it and returned to the DME. So they could see if all cylinders were firing, and that was changed completely in the M62. So yes, even with a good battery, you got a really feeble spark. Little yellow thing it was. I remember seeing it and thinking, if that was a motorbike, it was never going to start. But no, a little yellow spark and too much fuel and low battery voltage, and it just wouldn't start. And then, of course, we get into this situation where the next time you tried to start it, it'd fill it up with petrol, and then we'd get the nickel being melted off of the bores and the silicon carbide falling off with it. No, it didn't do BMWs any favour at all. And if they'd have got to the bottom of the Nikasil plating problem, they might well have carried on with it, but they'd lost face so much that they had to revert to the same process, or a very similar process, as used in the V12 in the M70. And that used not plating at all, but a high percentage of silicon carbide in the smelting mix. If you put enough silicon carbide in the mix, when you cast a cylinder block, then the silicon carbide precipitates out of the base material and provides a very hard surface, and then it was spark eroded and honed, still top secret stuff, and to provide an oleophilic bore where the piston and rings just floated up and down on oil. Now, the reason why they didn't want to use that process on the M70 was the fact that it was very expensive. Silicon carbide is much more expensive than the aluminium and copper and all the other stuff they put into the smelting mix. And you have to have 17% of it before it actually starts to precipitate. So unfortunately, casting a cylinder block with high silicon carbide content was very expensive, and that's the reason they didn't want to use it with the M60, which was a great shame because it was a rotten start for the V8s. And hopefully a few people have forgotten about the Nikasil fiasco, but it still appears on all the forums all the time, people asking why, well, if their Nikasil bore is going to fail. And it's the same with the XK8 as well. A lot of worry there, but more posts on the fact that they flood as well. And of course, that's the reason why the plating came off in the first place, combined with high sulfur fuels. Of course, these days we don't have high sulfur fuels. We have ULS, ultra low sulfur fuels. And so the nickel never gets frizzled off of the bores, no matter how much you flood it, and that's good news, because my E32 used to flood great regularity. It was a real pain in the neck to get that going sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, that's it. We can wrap that up. I'm sure to get lots of comments on this one saying I'm talking rubbish, because it's never been postulated before that the software was the problem. But I truly believe that software was the problem. Those 4 lines of code that squirted the fuel into the engine every time you turned the key from all 8 injectors, and that's obviously into cylinders where half of the valves are closed, and then the engine doesn't turn over properly. It was a recipe for disaster. But I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who don't think this is the case. Well, I'd like to hear what your theories are as well. I'd like to hear why there's so many Nikasil plated engines out there which are still running today and went all the way through the high sulfur content fuels. It says that it was only certain places within the world that this occurred, but those places take over most of the world, which includes the UK, the US to start with, and a lot of other places. So yes, I mean, it's a tricky problem, and one that BMW never solved in the end, which was a great shame because it was a rotten start for the brand new V8, And it's a shame, it's such a fantastic engine as well, and so advanced for its time. No, it's a real great shame. And of course the V8s that went on after it, chain guides, Vanos, and then with the N62 in my 650i, you've got so many things that can go wrong, and the stem seals being the worst of them. But don't forget all the other bits and bobs like the variable valve lift and twin Vanos and so many other things which go wrong with that engine. No, the M60 in 2020 is seen as a powerful, reliable, economic engine, and it really should have stayed that way. So anyway, thanks very much for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Don't forget to hit the like button and send me your comments. I'd love to hear your alternative reasons why Nikasil plating was a failure. See you next time.